Hey guys, got a little summer check-in for you here. I'm not even sure how many people will watch this. I'm not going to share it on any social media or Google Classroom or anything. I did. I do notice I have a few subscribers though, so we'll go from there. And if anybody watches, is great. If you get something out of it, awesome. If not, yeah, at least I spent a few nice minutes talking about some things here as we get into the summer months. You can tell I'm outside today probably by hearing the power tools and the birds and everything in the background. Hopefully, it's not too distracting. But it's summertime. It's not officially summer for a couple more days, but it weather-wise obviously is pretty much summer already. And so I thought we'll be outside today and do this as I'm in between getting some yard work and gardening and stuff like that done. So I did want to not only just check in with people over the summer here as we are navigating all this weird time and trying to figure out how we're going to be coming back to school eventually. Hopefully, we're going back to school eventually. And how sports are going to be different coming up in the next school year and how we're going to still be able to have sports and all of that. But I also want to talk a little bit about this specific date that I'm making this video on, because it's getting a lot of attention lately, as you've probably seen in the news. Not only are we still in the middle of the COVID pandemic, which is getting worse as lots of states have reopened a lot earlier than they probably should have, but also we've seen all of the racial unrest surrounding the horrible death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And we're seeing, what looks like it might be kind of a watershed moment, similar to what maybe we saw in the 60s and 70s with the civil rights movement. And so this date has gotten a lot more attention this year, and it's a date that really should probably have always gotten more attention, but it is something that falls generally outside of the regular school year, and so it's different from dates like Pearl Harbor Day and 9/11 and VE Day for World War II and President's Day and all those things, in that you're not in school with a forum ready to talk about it while it happens. And so that may be one of the big reasons why we generally haven't given it the attention it deserves. But June 19th is often called Juneteenth, and it has been celebrated for well over 100 years. But a lot of people don't realize what it's really about. So what Juneteenth commemorates is the end of slavery, the effective end of slavery. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, wait a second, I thought that happened earlier than that, on June 19th, 1865. I mean, the Civil War ended in April of 1865, if you know your history, and the Emancipation Proclamation was actually given in 1863, so why is it 1865 on June 19th that we celebrate the end of slavery? Well, you have to understand how all this played out. For one thing, we often learn in school, or we think, we kind of know growing up, that the Emancipation Proclamation is what ends slavery, but it really doesn't. The Emancipation Proclamation, hold on, I got a big truck coming by. Wait till it passes before I talk a little more here. Sorry for my video quality here. But the Emancipation Proclamation actually did not end any slavery. They did not free any slaves because, one, it only applied to the states that were in open rebellion to the Union. So 3 states that did not secede, the states of Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky, had slavery, and the Emancipation Proclamation did not declare slavery to be illegal in those states. It only officially declared slaves to be free in the states that were rebelling, and of course they were rebelling. So it wasn't like they were just going to let their slaves free because President Lincoln said so. They didn't even acknowledge that President Lincoln was the president, because they were, in their minds, a separate country at that point, the Confederate States. So that is the biggest reason why you shouldn't really think of the Emancipation Proclamation as the end of slavery. But even the end of the Civil War wasn't the complete end of slavery. It was, on paper, the end, because the 13th Amendment had already been ratified. That was something Lincoln was pretty adamant about. He wanted to get rid of the 13th Amendment, or he wanted to ratify the 13th Amendment before the war was over, so that when the Confederate States came back to the Union, they had to accept it, and they had to accept the end of slavery. And so you would think the end of the Civil War would kind of mark the official end of slavery, but in a lot of parts of the South, fighting kept going on and drug on for a few months after Lee surrendered Appomattox, and even after the final Confederate general in Georgia surrendered, which was usually seen as the official end of the war. There were still pockets of the far South, especially the Deep South, where they didn't really know about it and where they kept kind of going about their business. And Juneteenth recognizes the day that Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas. And that was the last part of the Confederacy where slaves were still being slaves. They were still confined to their land and working the land and considered the property of their owners. And once the Union troops arrived in Galveston, they officially announced on June 19th, 1865, that the war had been over and that slavery was now abolished. And so that was when all of the rest of the slaves, the last few remaining slaves in the Union, were set free. So it is the effective day that slavery ended, the practical day that slavery was ended for all intents and purposes. And so that is a big reason why this day has been celebrated a lot. Of course, if you've studied any history, you know that the end of slavery wasn't the end of all of our problems, obviously, with race. You have Jim Crow laws and segregation and voting restrictions throughout the South after the end of Reconstruction. We dealt with a huge chunk of that in the 1960s and 70s with the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of progress was made, and that was, obviously a big series of steps forward for us. But at the same time, we left a lot of things undone, and that's kind of what you're seeing happening around you right now, is the stuff that's being left undone, or that was left undone by the Civil Rights Movement, is now kind of coming to the forefront in a way that it really hasn't in the last 40 to 50 years, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the protests that erupted, and several other black people, men and women, who have died at the hands of the police. And that's been a long-standing complaint among the black community, is that the police sort of treat them more unfairly than they do the white population and other ethnic groups. So that's what's happening now. So hopefully you're staying engaged and you're staying up to date on things and you're paying attention to what's going on, because this is I think 2020 is going to go down as one of those years when we look back, we talk about a lot in history classes, because a lot of things are happening this year that are going to cause a lot of pretty profound changes to our society. So that's my little summer check-in. This is a little longer video than normal, but it's the only one I plan on making over the summer. So hopefully if you watch it, you don't get too bored listening to me drone on about it, and hopefully the power tools and the chirping birds weren't a big distraction for you. And I hope you have a great rest of your summer. I'm very hopeful that we get to come back to school in some capacity, and I actually get to see some students' faces in August. So we'll keep you updated on that. And have a great rest of your day and rest of your summer. Thanks, guys.